Welcome! Today we're going to be going over some hatching techniques. We're actually going to be covering 6 different manners of hatching, and in the next video we'll go on to some kind of beyond hatching techniques. I've covered some of these before in smaller ways, but I thought it would be good to have it all in a single video and just have the ability to see how all of these techniques kind of come to light. So I'm going to start by giving myself just some very basic, kind of funky objects to work on for these 6 techniques. Obviously, I could do this with just a simple sphere, but this will be a little bit more entertaining if I've got something a little bit different. Let's start with those 4 to begin with. So the first technique we're going to be working with is just our very stereotypical hatching. So this is just a series of marks going in basically the same direction. This means that the marks are going to shift as we go around the object, which I'm going to go ahead and just give myself the exterior of this object. And as I start shading, I'm thinking about light coming from a particular angle. In this one, let's just go light straight from above, okay? And I'm going to start with my marks. Now these marks are going to shift and change as they move around the object, but they are not going to cross each other. They are always going to be moving around the circumference of the object. In some cases, if I wanted to indicate that there was a divot, a dark part out like this right here, I can do that along the main surface. But in general, I am just going to use these hatching marks to show where the shading is, which is why there's more here and it's lighter there. This is showing again that this surface in particular right here is getting hit by the light. So I'm going to continue moving these down. As I get closer to the bottom of the object itself, we are going to have more marks. The marks are going to be closer to one another, and that is going to indicate that there's more shadow down here. Do the marks all have to go in a perfect direction? They don't. On this, actually, because this is a rock form, I can kind of make them go any way I want. And in general, it's going to look correct as long as the overarching shadow level is correct for where we are on the object. But this is the most stereotypical, the most basic of hatching techniques, and is generally what we're talking about when we simply refer to something as hatching. The one that's going to follow this is called cross-hatching, and it is, again, a very simple, very basic level of hatching. Very basic technique, and can sometimes be assumed as just being the prominent form. So that's going to be our first little object there. Let's go ahead and move over to our second one, which is just cross-hatching. And all that means in general is that you're using perpendicular lines. They don't have to be. You could actually do it like this, and I might on this one. But this is just cross-hatching. Let's change our light source a little bit here. Let's think about the light coming from the right. That'll just help out with making things a little different. And in this, I'm going to go ahead and give myself the exterior surface. Now, you might be wondering why I'm bothered to sketch in pencil if I was going to go ahead and do ink around the outside. That's because for some techniques, though probably not any we'll cover today, it is actually better not to do that. If you're working with a highly textured surface, for example, you might have things that protrude. Okay, so I am going to start on this one by doing very similar to what I did here, but when I get into the darker areas, I'm going to allow myself to make more hatching marks to indicate the way that it's going. And the way that I'm going to decide which direction my hatching marks are going on this drawing is the opposite way around the object. If you think about it this way, we could wrap things like this, we could wrap things like this. So when I do my cross-hatching, like I might do a little bit right here, I'm just going perpendicular to the original lines that I threw down. If I wanted to do the same thing here, let's assume maybe there's a little ledge of stone right here that is, causing a crack, and so we're getting some really dark tones here. You might do something like that. But basically what we're going to do is we're just going to try to work our contoured lines moving around the exterior of the object itself. And then when we want to tighten things up, we want to make things a little bit darker, we will go ahead and use our cross contour, our cross hatching. For either of these techniques, it is not particularly important how long your strokes are. For the next one, we are actually going to work only on using tiny little strokes, and it will have a slightly different effect. You might be wondering as we go over these if one of these is better than another, since it seems like they will build in level of complication as we go. But that is not the case. In fact, one of the best things about learning a whole bunch of techniques is that each time you use a technique, they will necessarily distinguish themselves as being different from other portions of your drawing. And so when I do large-scale ink drawings, I will often, sometimes arbitrarily, sometimes purposefully, choose to use a particular technique for different surfaces. If I have a creature, for example, that I want to stick out from the background or from rock and stone, I'm going to try to use different techniques so that our eyes naturally know when they look at it that those are different surfaces. All right, I'm starting with my cross hatching here, and I'm just going to build it slowly from the bottom to indicate areas of high shadow. And you can already see that it provides a lot more texture and intensity. We can see, like, for example, this face, though still in shadow, is receiving a little bit more light than this back face. And I like how that's working. I'm going to keep building on this, going a little bit lighter with my cross hatching as I get up towards the top. I'm going to try to link in this dark shape here. And maybe I'll even use a little bit of cross hatching up in this portion. Kind of indicate the movement of the rock face itself. And just a little bit down here where maybe that lip is rolling underneath and it looks a little bit darker. So that would be our cross hatching. It's definitely a different strategy. For a lot of the time that I've spent drawing, I thought this was just the superior technique. But nowadays, I don't think that's true. I think that it is just a different technique. It's going to give you different things and a different aesthetic than the others will. All right, this next one is mini hatching. It's pretty much just the same as our initial hatching, but it's focusing specifically on using tiny little hatch marks. We're going to go mini hatch. And let's go ahead and think about this light source again coming from directly above. And we'll give ourselves the perimeter of our object. So much like we did with the hatching one, we're going to start here by just using a ton of tiny little marks, but they're going to follow pretty much the same direction that the hatching did. We're just going to try to be careful and use only small marks and see how that distinguishes things, because it will give us just a little bit of a different aesthetic. In this technique, I might vary how close I put the lines together in a fashion to indicate how dark something is, but the texture is going to be fairly different than that first one. And with the tiny marks, you can often leave fewer areas that are white, like we did on the first one, but that's not always a bad thing either. All right, we're working around that first area. We're starting to head down the object itself. So this is going to be, in my mind, catching quite a bit of light, but it's not totally flat. So we're going to have these tiny little marks. I'm going to make sure that I have more of them on the edge of the object, because that's where things are getting compacted. And so in general, it's not a bad idea to shade a little bit more around the sides of your object, because things tend to get pushed together. You can observe this in your normal life by just taking a water bottle or a can of Coke or something and just slowly rotate it in your hand and look at the sides. And as things get compressed, often the colors and the words and all of the textures on the side of whatever cylindrical object it is will start to look a little bit darker. We are starting to move to the portion of this where it is going to be in shadow because it's curving underneath. So I'm going to start layering up these marks a little bit closer to one another, and we'll get a darker tone. This is obviously a little bit more monotonous than the others, and that might make it better or worse for you, depending on what kind of artist you are. Some of us really like the slow, monotonous drawing. There's something peaceful about just being able to tune things out, listen to something, watch something, or just be alone with our own thoughts while we work. I like this technique for illustrating some level of hair or fuzziness on an object. It's often good if there's an area that's covered in a lot of grass or something like that, but it is just a different hatching technique and one that will help you vary up the textures, especially in a large scale drawing where it's a good idea to have a lot of different textures to separate out all of your forms. So you can see how that one kind of comes out. All right, our fourth here is long line hatching, and this is going to be the opposite here. We are going to try, though this is a little bit difficult, and this is one where you really are going to want to turn your page or turn your sketchbook sideways if you need to. This might not even technically be a hatching technique, but I think it kind of fits in the same category, certainly more than some of the other ones we're going to be looking at. We're also going to do this one directly from above as far as our light source goes, and let's go ahead and give ourselves the perimeter of this. I already know right off the bat that my instinct is to turn my paper this way. It's just going to be easier for my wrist to do that, and let's see if I can position myself in such a way that I can do that real quick. This is just a strategy that's going to make this a lot easier. Our wrists generally draw straighter lines or even curved lines like this better when they're coming towards us. So don't feel like you can't move your supplies to accomplish what you need to. On this one, I am actually going to start from the bottom, and I'm going to try as much as I can to use singular lines and just keep weaving them back and forth to indicate the texture. This really doesn't feel much like hatching, and these lines don't need to continue the whole way. They could just be extraordinarily longer lines. This is obviously going to give a very different feel to your drawing, but it might be what you need. I like using this for things like stalagmites and stalactites. It seems to be an interesting way to represent that slow, layered stone. Somewhere in my mind I'm thinking it might be good for bone as well, but I don't know. You can see though that this is just very slowly working back and forth, trying to create these shapes, and I will go back in and modify some of this a little bit once we get higher up. All right, we're getting closer to the top, so I need to start making these lines a little bit further apart. Maybe some shorter lines to kind of indicate what's happening. Let's take a look at that. So it very much looks like a sedimentary rock. If we go back in here, we can give little bits of hatching in some of these alcoves to kind of increase the texture, increase the darkness level. And this would probably also be a very good strategy to incorporate some of the other elements, some mini hatching or even some cross hatching in certain portions. And you can see this is just a very different strategy and is going to give you some really different results. Might be ideal for certain portions of your drawings and might be a really terrible idea for others. All right, this next one is I'm calling curved or bump hatching, and it's going to be trying to focus on doing your marks curved. So it's very similar to the mini hatching, but it's going to be a little bit different. This one is very close to just not being hatching again, but that's okay. Let's give ourselves almost a gourd type of thing here. That'll be fun to work with. Let's do light from a different angle. So we'll do it from this side. So on this one, we're going to start off very similarly to how we did here, but instead of using straight lines, we're going to use curved lines. This is one of those things that seems a little odd perhaps, but it will naturally imply a different texture than what the others will. The mini hatching, for example, implies that there's some roughness, some texture to the object. In fact, with hatching in general, it's kind of hard to make something appear as if it's totally smooth. There are strategies to do that, and I have covered some of them in another video, which I will link below, which is kind of a nice video working on a cylinder and how the different kinds of hatching techniques are going to represent texture there. But this is not only going to imply that there's texture, it's going to imply that there's a particular kind of texture. And this is really kind of the branch into the techniques that I'm going to work on for the next video, which is going to be we're moving beyond just hatching and seeing what kinds of marks we can actually use that will still communicate shading and texture, but maybe in way more interesting ways. Maybe in some ways that are just going to make your life a little bit more fun, or just going to be exactly what you need for that particular texture on your drawing. Now, this might have seemed very strange at first, but I'm sure you can see already that those tiny little hatch marks, those little curves and bumps, are actually communicating the shading. They're actually making this object look semi-three-dimensional, which is an interesting thing. This is a technique that I have only rather recently become aware of, one that I didn't use growing up at all. But the more I delve into ink drawing, the more experience I gain, the more I look into how the experts are doing things, the more I am amazed at how many different techniques you can use that all still accomplish the purpose. Now I'm going to continue to layer these on a little bit here on the bottom to just increase our shadow and make it very clear that this is the underside of that object. Now, if I was going to do this one again, I would probably make sure I kept that exterior, the pencil drawing, like I mentioned earlier, and actually put some bumps along that edge, because that's probably how that would work. After the fact here, it's certainly still possible, though not as perfect. But I am going to go around and just increase some bumps along those edges, and you're going to get this. Now, what if we had a little like overhang, right? Let's take this area and we're just going to overlay some curves here, and that will make it look like this right here has a little portion that's coming toward us and therefore is casting a shadow. All right, well, we're going to move on to our last technique here, which I am going to call the Omni hatch. And this is just, you are using hatch marks, but they can come from any angle, and we're going to see how that works. So we're going to have some cross hatching, some multi-layered cross hatching, some regular hatching. This basically is anything goes. Omni hatch. And let's do this from the right again, just to flip back. All right, let's go ahead and give ourselves an object, and we will start working. Okay, cool. So this is obviously going to have some shadow in here, but then more kind of stark contrast in here. So let's go ahead and we're just gonna start by laying down a quick layer. This is kind of a stress relieving strategy once you understand how it works, because the reality is you're just focusing on making sure that the darkness is how it should be. So it doesn't really matter as much which direction things go. I still can't detach myself entirely from the notion that my marks should be curving around the object, so you're still going to see some of that. But as we get into kind of some more details and texture and layering, you're going to notice that things start to build up. So this technique is really riffing off the idea that it doesn't really matter which direction your marks are going. It helps. It certainly implies where things are going, how the stone or the surface is moving. But at the end of the day, our eyes only really need the contrast between things, the lights and the darks. Those will tell us all that we need to know about the surface of an object. So even though I've put so much time into making sure everything is represented fairly accurately, In this technique, we're going to kind of go the opposite way. This is one of the wonderful parts about drawing in general, is that while there are rules, they don't often always apply. And you usually have a lot of techniques that can be used to great effect to try different things. So even though our marks are going very different directions, you can already tell that this is working, that this looks as if it is a three-dimensional object. So I'm just going to go ahead and kind of close in some of these shapes. I'm going to really make these areas over here much, much, much darker. The only thing that I will say about this technique that might make it a little bit more difficult is whereas these will actually help you when you're not 100% sure what the three-dimensionality of an object should be, this technique will not. This technique requires you to have a firm understanding of what's happening with each of your faces. Like I know that this face is getting some sun, but not pure sun. This face down here is getting a little bit more. This is getting a halftone. This is a shadow. This is a deeper shadow. This is a midtone. These are your core shadows, the darkest parts of the entire thing. There's a little bit more subtlety there. So this might be a technique that you experiment with on shapes that you really have a good understanding of at first, and then over time start implementing a little bit more. I kind of enjoy it. It was a freeing thing to realize that there's so many different ways to do this and accomplish things, but it definitely is a very easy strategy to make things messy, which might not be what you're going for. So, but this has been 6 different hatching techniques that are all going to give you slightly different ways of accomplishing the same thing. And you can already see, as we look at these 6, if you had all of these in a single drawing, this would give you some crazy variance from one thing to another, and would give you the ability for the creature, the background, the character you have to really stick out from the other things in that image. Well, I hope this was helpful. I'd love to hear below which of these techniques is your favorite, especially if there's one you haven't done before and you're now trying it. I would also like to hear what you're drawing using these techniques. If you can share that in the comments below, that would be wonderful. Thank you to my patrons who are on the screen now for their support. If you want to check out my Patreon, you can do so in the link below. There's also a link to the Discord server below, which is just a small art community where we help each other out, we share the things that we're working on, and basically, we all need community. Well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon.